Hey guys, today I wanted to talk a little bit about SSD performance, and I purchased a PCI Express 4 SSD and it's been performing well, and I also purchased a PCI Express 3.0 SSD on a budget, and I wanted to compare the two, so I ran Crystal Disk Mark and everything seemed to turn out okay, but when I started to transfer large files on the slower drive, I started to see some issues, and I just wanted to share this and get this out there because I think it's kind of important to know and understand what happens with sustained write performance after the cache is filled up on an SSD drive. So let's take a look at some numbers, and let's take a look at an article written by the good people over at STH, or Serve the Home. So this is an article reviewing the PNY CS1030 1TB drive. This is the drive that I purchased. It's the PCI Express 3.0 drive that I have. So here they go and review the SSD. Here's what it looks like. It's an M.2 drive. They run through it. They have some performance numbers, and on page 2 they actually run a Crystal Disk Mark performance number, and you can look at that versus mine. They're getting 2468. I'm getting 2360. They're getting a little under 1600. I'm getting more than 1600. From bin to bin, you're going to get different tests, and this could be definitely within the margin of error. So they go through that and they say, okay, here's what all the reads are. And what I really like that they do at the end of the article, they actually go through something called sustained write performance. So they say it's not a benchmark, but I say this is probably one of the most important things that's going to happen when you're doing something like me. I like to write data in a sequential format, like large amounts of data. If I'm doing any type of video editing or anything, I'm going to be doing this a lot. So they run it, and they're seeing 431 megabytes per second on their write speed right here. So they call this out, and it's really interesting. It almost looks like they mixed up the CS1030 and the CS2130. The CS2130 is at 100 megabits per second post-cache write speed, and the 130 is at 430 megabits per second. That's not what I'm saying on my side. Here's my PCI Express 3 drive. So this number looks good. 2300 sequential read. That, you may think, okay, that's what I'm going to get when I'm actually going to write data. But when we actually write data, the numbers look very, very different. Here is a snapshot of what it actually looks like when I'm writing data with the CS1030 drive. So I have some, you can see the temperatures right there. Pretty cool, 55 Celsius temperature utilization. We have a read, the top read peak write was 132 megabytes per second once I kicked this off. You can see at the very beginning it was writing very quickly, and then as soon as the cache fills up, it drops off heavily right over here on this side where my mouse is, and then it writes for a little bit longer, and then it drops significantly off a cliff down to 63, 64, 65 megabytes per second for the remainder of the transfer. And I wasn't transferring that many files. I had about, I was at 86% complete with 10 gigs left. I was only transferring a couple hundred gigs, if that. So this is what I wanted to mention, is that you get performance that drops off super heavily with some of these cheap SSDs. They have poor performance after they fill up their cache. So for the short bursts, like if you're loading a game for 30 seconds, you're going to be in this threshold over here where you have that really high-end performance, and then as things continue to write, as the drive starts to warm up, as its cache starts to fill up, you're going to lose that performance over time. This doesn't necessarily happen with every single SSD either. Here's my PCI Express 4 drive. When I'm transferring the exact same workload, I copied this workload to my other drive and I ran it. Much lower temperature, but the write speed is 10 times faster. And both of these, I'll have you know, is much lower than the megabytes per second sequential speed that was tested. So we're only getting 556 megabytes per second sequential read speed. That is very slow versus the Crystal Disk Mark 2360 of this drive, or we have this specific drive should be running at 5,000 megabytes per second. It's my PCI Express 4 drive, but it's running at 500 megabytes per second. 10 times slower. megabytes, capital B, megabytes, capital B. So we're not doing megabits versus megabytes or anything like that. There's just some issues. Anyway, that's something I wanted to call out that I've noticed that's been happening with some SSDs, and I want to make sure you're aware of it. I definitely am a little disappointed with the speed of my SSDs just because of what the performance numbers are. The performance numbers say it's 5,000 megabytes per second, and the actual number is 500 megabytes per second. Or it's 2,300 megabytes per second, but it's really 60. That's a massive, massive difference in performance. Not everybody does those long-form sequential testing of real-world data. And I don't think SSD companies are being held accountable for the numbers that they publish versus the real-world numbers that you get. So I guess this is one of those, hey, make sure you check out independent reviews for a specific SSD, and not just any independent review, reviewers that actually go through and test this in the real world, because anyone can kick up a benchmark and run it, and the benchmark comes back so fast, but you may only be testing a 1 gig for that specific benchmark, and you really need to test 500 gigs, the entire size of the drive. What does it look like after you've written all those new blocks and you're starting to overwrite data? How does the SSD handle that? Because the SSD has to clean the block. It can't just overwrite it like it can on a physical disk. So there's things that just be careful when you purchase SSDs, or if you are purchasing a cheap SSD, just understand that the write performance and the read performance might not be nearly as fast. Sometimes it's an order of magnitude slower than what they advertise. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.